Okay, so today we're going to explore the mechanism of the three gunas. The Bhagavad Gita describes in the 14th chapter the nature of the three gunas. Now we're going to talk about the mechanism of the three gunas. So I'll do this graphically. That's my orientation to these things. So to give you a sense of how this works. So this is the creation, the Prakriti. This is the Sat. So the Sat, of course, is pervading everything, but we're just going to give it a place, pretending that it's a location. Now, the vibrational frequency of creation is that the Sat manifests itself in all directions. You mean from the nothing, from the non-existence comes existence. So there's this outward expression of the Sat into the Tat. That outward expression is consciousness itself, Chit. This is energy, movement. So the gunas are the three modes of movement, vibration, from the most subtle to the most gross, from the most freed to the most embedded. It is all this movement of consciousness that is what creates existence. And it is constantly moving, not just outwardly, but also within currents within itself. This movement are the three modes of existence. So one way of understanding these three modes is to recognize that each is a different frequency. So I'm going to just use pointing downward. That when we come the furthest, if this is the Sat, the transcendent Sat, then this is the Sat that's completely embedded in matter, which we can call Asat. It's also Sat, you could call this the dark Lord and the light Lord, right? Whichever way you want to describe it. So basically, Sat positions itself in this tension where there is one that is unconscious, absolutely, totally unconscious, absolutely inconscient, so that it appears there is no consciousness there at all, no truth there at all, as well as one that's superconscious, conscious is everything at the same time. It's this tension that has allowed the creation. So this Sat is in matter, and it's always striving to come out from its unconscious condition. It's always rising, like a seed planted deep in the soil. It's a shoot that comes out unconsciously, not knowing, striving for something more. It wants more consciousness, more of itself. It wants to be more awake. So the entire movement of nature is this transcendent condition from which the creation originated, and this embedded condition of which that which is the source of creation is trying to manifest itself. It's trying to emerge up, back out. So it's these two tensions, one from above, one from below. So this movement in both of these actions are the gunas. If we look at the division of how this looks like, the vast quantum of the spaciousness of the creation is taken up in Sattva. Sattva carries something of the nature of the Sat. Sattva is therefore has a quality of the Sat, and the quality, the essence of the nature of Sat is silence and stillness. In this silence and stillness, consciousness is happy. It's complete. It's fulfilled. And the more and more it is in proximity of the source, the more profound and deep is that happiness and fulfillment. The further away from the source it is, the less and less happy it is. In this higher transitional points in sattva, the attention is still turned to the source, to the transcendent. But as it descends back in, its attention turns to that which it's descending into. So this movement of sattva has two directions, one to its origin and one to that which is the opposite of its origin, the creation. As it descends, it becomes interested. It becomes paying attention to that which it's descending into, and in the process of giving attention, as I've said, it's empowering the thing it's attending to, and it's making that which it's attending to more powerful, and therefore itself less powerful. So just imagine this as an individual ray of the sat, finding itself getting involved in the creation through this process of descent. And at some point, it becomes immersed into the next vibrational frequency, which is rajas. Rajas is the attachment to action, to doing, to activity, to movement. It's seeking as consciousness to move, to express, to go from where it was to some other place. It is now entering into duality in much greater degree because it's taking a direction. And a direction means a movement in one direction versus another direction. So there's this movement that's occurring now, and the consciousness is becoming involved into the vibrational frequencies. Now, in this dimension, that which was subtle is now becoming more dense only as a force, where before it was less force, it was just spaciousness. Now it's taking on energy. So if I was going to define this in terms of experience on the spiritual path, these subtle dimensions are the heavens. These are where consciousness comes in and starts coming from its huge light and expansiveness and starts taking on a force and a shape. And they become more clear and distinct. These are the topical beings. These are beings that have not yet entered into the human consciousness. They're coming from the source, the transcendent source, and they're coming down into the world because they're interested. And they're giving consent to that descent. And they're becoming interested in participating and playing because this is the mode that they can act through. So they bring their forces down to that which it's attending to. And you can meet these beings when one goes through the process of transcendence, from dense particular forms in the subtle world to less and less distinct forms, but more force, more light, more glory, so on and so forth, as we begin to transcend. So they're in the domain of the sattva rajas. They're quite distinct. But once you get beyond the domain of the sattva, of the rajas, and more to the sattva, they lose their distinction. They become more expansive, more infinite. It's harder to see anything distinct from anything else. So in meditation or in samadhi, you can experience these states where there's very definite experiences at first, but as you go higher and higher, there's less and less to define, less and less to know. And then we move into what we call samadhi, which is just awareness absorbed in its own awareness. All right, so the rajas is to action, and then of course the last is tamas. And tamas is the inevitable byproduct of the momentum of the descending energy becoming not knowing when to stop, not knowing that it should withdraw its consent, not knowing that it's going into places where it will lose any enjoyment, it will lose any enchantment, which is what this dimension offers for consciousness. And it becomes more and more rigid, more and more stuck, more and more defined, limited, obscured, until it forgets itself and it descends into a condition somewhere in the proximity of the asat. Now, when the consciousness descends somewhere in the proximity of the asat, we call this suffering, but there's not enough consciousness to know there's suffering. It's only actually when the tamas becomes more rajasic that it becomes aware of its suffering. It's like when you're asleep, you don't know you have pain, but when you wake up, you know you're in pain. So asleep, there's no pain. So this is sleeping. Another way to think of the tamas, rajas, and sattva is sleep, dream, and waking consciousness. So it's an approximation of this movement of consciousness to becoming embedded in matter, coming down and becoming so embedded in matter, now all it wants to do is get out of its embedment. So this is the design, this is the mechanism. The more we are in tamas, the more we give power, attention to our tamas, the more tamasic we become. The more we apply effort, struggle out of our tamas, the more rajasic we become, the more masterful, but the more individual we are. The more we have to apply effort, we have to conquer ourselves, we have to conquer nature, we have to be strong, we have to come up out of it. The ego lays claim to that efforting. And it's only when that efforting begins to sense something greater than itself that the ego starts relaxing and giving over that identity with that efforting to something greater. And that's when sacrifice occurs. That's when it starts merging out of what is remaining in its tamasic and lower rajasic life and starts offering it up to something greater and greater. And it begins an ascending process. Since there are two concurrent forces in existence, an asat that's hidden, embedded in matter, and a sat that's transcendent and far beyond matter, they actually end up working together. So that there is an asat that resides hidden within the soul that has absorbed itself into tamas. And that asat is the kundalini. It lays embedded in the first chakra. And when it comes to a certain point, it assists the emerging soul out of its tamas into a higher frequency of consciousness. So that the experiential people who tend to awaken through a kundalini experience, their systems tend to be more tamasic. Then there are other souls who they reach up, who are not as tamasic, more rajasic, who are looking for relief from the endless suffering of rajas, the endless dissatisfaction and complaint of rajas. And it's reaching up to something. Then a descending force comes through the crown and starts descending into the system. Ultimately, the two interface with each other. The one who is awakening through the kundalini, if the process is allowed to continue and not get distracted, then a descending force will come in and meet the arising kundalini force, and together they will assure the continued development of the consciousness towards its super awakened state. It also happens that if there is a descending force that's coming into the system, that through the crown chakra, as it descends, if it's allowed to go to its full depth, will also awaken the asat, the dark sat, within itself and awaken the kundalini so that it can ultimately be met together. Ultimately, the fulfillment is the awakening of the asat and the descent of the sat in the third chakra. And this is the transformative force, the Agni force, in which that which is left to be transmuted is transmuted and one returns to their original condition. So this is understanding the mechanism of the overall picture of the three gunas and how it affects the spiritual seeker. Now, I'm going to look at this from numbers of more particularized angles that may give you a greater intellectual understanding of this, because I've known this for many years, and I have been able to recognize that when one becomes aware of these gunas, your capacity for changing reality, what appears to be reality, is greatly enhanced. Because the nature of the appearance of things is only an appearance. And when you can see the mechanism behind the appearance, apparent miracles can happen. So the greatest powerful force is the sought. Consciousness that's closest to the sought has the biggest capacity to affect the apparency of the creation, versus a force that's much more embedded in the creation. So it's proportional. Understanding how it works will only come if there is a purpose. So the purpose, of course, the creation has a purpose. Its purpose is this constant movement of descending and ascending, descending and ascending, descending and ascending, and each have a validity, just like a positive and a negative current have a validity. Without the two of them, there is no electricity, there is no movement. And the creation is about movement, and the sought delights in movement. So this is how it works. This is how the whole thing is balanced. Now, one of the things you can see is that the nature of the sought, when it first expresses its energy into creation, is that at first, when it descends out of the creation, it is actually absolutely free. The pure power of the sought is fully expressed. We call this cosmic. We call it a force that's beyond the three gunas. It is uninhibited. It's not met anything to stop it. But as soon as it starts encountering the creation, it starts taking on a bouncing back and forth as it starts meeting the creation. And it starts changing its frequency, getting more and more and more entangled until it becomes completely embedded. So consciousness, matter, is nothing but embedded consciousness. It's locked up in the densest to the subtlest, proportional, not just physical matter, subtle matter, mental matter. These are all forms of mattering, right? They all have an existence. To matter is to exist. So the mind has its own density. The vital, the emotions have their own density. The body has its own density. And there are greater densities than our physical bodies that go on quite far. So the density means that basically consciousness consolidates and it becomes a particulate. The wave becomes a particulate. It takes on apparency of shape, form, space, time, dimension, measurement. It becomes definitive. It's still consciousness, but embedded. This is going on concurrently. It's going on all the time, endlessly. So therefore, right now, we're inhabiting a body that is full of embedded consciousness. Every cell has its own little genius, its own little string, its own little purpose. And every cell interacting with other cells, they create a consensus. They call it a cluster, like the kidneys are one set. It has its own genius, its own little cluster of synergies that allow the filtering of toxins in the system. Then the lungs that breathe, and so on and so forth. So we occupy a vehicle of incredible complexities, all of which are living purposefully. The more dense it is, the more rigid it is, like bone is more dense. Then you have ligament and tendons and muscles. See, it's all consciousness, in different forms of embodiment, which has learned to work together cooperatively because of this intelligence that's behind this entire creation. Because the Sat is the source of intelligence. The Sat is the source of action. It's the source. It is the source of our I-ness as well. So it is what organizes all this activity and gives it a purpose, even though it doesn't know the purpose, even as a shoot comes out from the ground, from a seed, not knowing what up is, but still finding up. Or a bird knowing that the weather is changing and to fly that way and not that way. It becomes the mind of creation. It becomes the organizing intelligence that guides this whole creation. And when it's come to us, it's become this much more fluid, much more open, much more capable potentiality for knowing and experiencing, for applying its intelligence and its action. This is the uniqueness of the condition we find ourselves in. But within each of us, therefore, we have all of these three gunas. Every one of these three gunas are currently in us. Now, this gets down to the nature of understanding which, under recognizing not only that there are two expressions of the gunas. One, there is the current of the gunas that are always moving about us. And two, there is the vessel that receives the current. The vessel, the physical form of a person, has a dominance of a guna. There is the tendency for the gunas to be dominant. There's one overall guna, but then it can subdivide based on the mental, the vital, and the physical. So the physical can be tamasic, the vital could be rajasic, and the mental could be sattvic. But which is dominant has something to do with what the person is emphasized. So if the mental in this particular case was emphasized, then the nature would be more sattvic. The vital would be rajasic, but not as rajasic as other vitals, because the sattva rules over the vital, controls and manages the vital, but its inclination is restlessness and dissatisfaction. Its inclination is to action. And then in the physical, it's tamas. And because the sattva is greater and the rajas is perhaps more enhanced than others, then the tamas is less. And therefore it's more manageable. The person more can manage the senses. They can manage the impulses that arise from the body better than others. They can use their discrimination and apply their will and affect change around their own personal vehicle. A more sattvic person will be less interested in just itself. It'll be more interested in the world around it because it's attached to knowledge. It's attached to learning and growing. It's attached to evolving. So, but that's just one species. There's other types, right? Someone could be tamasic in the mental. They could be sattvic in the vital. And they could be rajasic in the physical. So you begin to see what would happen to someone who's sattvic. Let's just draw this. If this is the human system, the mental, the vital, and the physical. And each one of these has sattva, rajas, or tamas. Sattva, rajas, or tamas. Sattva, rajas, or tamas. So you have 9 possibilities. And the interfacing of those 9 possibilities give you a sense of the complexity of what it is that defines a person. For even if a person was sattvic in the mental, but what they gave their attention to was their rajasic vital, then they would be more of a demonstration of rajas. The rajas would be more dominant in their system, at least as long as they were doing that, even if they knew better. And so they're pulled from one project to the next project, one enthusiasm after the next enthusiasm, one accomplishment after the next accomplishment, not actually developing the innate sattva, but expanding unwittingly the restlessness of the rajas. And because of the nature of bondage primarily exists in the rajas and in the tamas, should this be the case, then rajas devolves always ultimately into tamas. It expends itself, gets entangled, and loses its ability to eradicate itself from what it has gotten involved in. So it tends to lose itself through exhaustion, through indulgence, through addiction, through habit. So then the system can become more tamasic. So in another phase of a person's life, they are more a demonstration of the tamas energy. Now, of course, if that happens, and the sattva may be able to come forward and discriminate and recognize what's going on and stop doing it before it loses its full authority. Or it could not and kill itself. I think the only way out is to destroy itself. So this is the nature of the complexities of the possibilities of these Shree gunas, and you can begin to apply this in innumerable ways, both to yourself and to other people. Now, let's talk about another thing about the gunas, is that they cycle. In the Gita class, I talked about no life can exist on a planet except unless there is a planet that is rotating on its own axis, revolving around the sun, that has a moon of a certain mass, I believe it's a third or something, of the vehicle, of the planet it's revolving around. And then what it basically creates is 3 different cycles of currents. The rotation of the axis day to day, the rotation of the moon around the earth, which creates the monthly cycles, and then the rotation of these 2 around the sun, which creates the yearly cycles. So we all know the yearly cycles, pretty much reflected as winter, spring, summer, and fall. The monthly cycle, women are, menstruation is often very tied into the moon cycle, as are the tides. And then the rotation, the day and the night, is a cycle. The morning is their best time, and the night is where they go to sleep. But there are some who it's the opposite. So, but it is still cycles within cycles within cycles. So it is the nature of the gunas that they're all cycling within us. So we each morning wake up in a certain guna. This is how you can begin to become aware of your individual daily guna cycle, is to notice how you are when you wake up. If you wake up with a lot of energy, ready to go, busy, jump out of bed, then that says rajas is there at the start of the day. If you don't wake up when you wake up, and you bump around and you hit the door and you're trying to figure out who you are and what this place is and what you're supposed to do, then your tamas cycle is there at the start of the day. And if you wake up in the morning and you're naturally feeling peaceful and connected, and that time of day is your best meditation, then you're starting the day in the sattvic cycle. So that's the beginning. Then if you watch during the day, the gunas cycle. So if you started the day in sattva, then basically the first part of the day there's this spaciousness, this peacefulness, this expansion. And then as the day goes on, you get more and more involved in the activities of the day. And so this expansion starts arcing. This ascension of the sattva phase, sattva always ascends, starts becoming more horizontal. That's what rajas is. In the Gita it says, sattva ascends, rajas is neutral, tamas descends. I would say that, rajas expands. Basically, that's what rajas does. It expands and expends itself. So, sattva ascends, rajas expands. We basically have that peace and stillness, and we find from peace and stillness a natural enthusiasm that comes interfacing with the creation. And it wants to expand that enthusiasm into action. Or you might say inspiration into action. So this movement into action then, the consciousness then starts exhausting through its activity, or distracting itself through its activity, because action takes energy. Energy then takes away from the state of consciousness, from sattva, and it evolves into action. It eventually begins to exhaust itself into tamas. And that contracts. Into a descending cycle. Okay, this time frame varies per each person. So all you have to do is look, to watch yourself. If you wake up in the morning and you do your morning meditation and you have your breakfast and then you do the things that you do for the day, then maybe it doesn't occur until late morning, or maybe it doesn't occur until early afternoon. But at some point in the day, it will make a movement. It'll shift out of it. So my teacher has said that basically there are three approximately 2 hour phases that occur. This can vary a great deal. So if you wake at 6, then around noon, you're hungry. You feel you need to feed the body because now you're back in the body and you don't have the energy you had before. You may have eaten in the morning and that helps support the body. It depends. Mentally, you can have a cup of coffee and go all day and you're not hungry until the afternoon. Just depends upon the nature of the activity. Then at that point, what happens is the tamas cycle can be harmoniously moved through fairly quickly, and then you begin another sattvic cycle. Or the tamas cycle will stay longer, depending upon other forces, other factors that are going on beside your independent rotation around the earth, the spinning on the axis cycle of the day. So depending upon the nature of the second cycle of the moon cycle will determine how long any one of these lasts. So if you look at this in another way, if we have a lunar cycle, you have a full moon, and then you have a new moon, approximately a 14-day period. In that 14-day period, there are cycles of the gunas. It could be one cycle where it goes into an ascending and then a descending phase within that 14-day period. Or it could be two cycles where there is an ascending and a descending and then an ascending and then a descending. Or there could be multiple cycles where the ascending and the descending occur quite frequently. The numbers of cycles determines your relationship with truth. How frequently you cycle. This is why we call a bipolar a disorder. Manic depressive, because the cycles are so rapid. Shows the consciousness is completely embedded in the content of the mind or the vital. And of course the body gets dragged along in that. So, and the longer the cycle, the more peaceful is the nature, the more integrated is the nature, the more the consciousness is forward, and the less the embodiment in matter is in mind or vital or body is reduced. So that's one of the clues. You can find your cycle if you can find what it feels like when you start in the morning. Now you can't do this unless you have sufficient sattva. If you don't have enough sattva in the mental, this whole thing is a useless exercise. If you're emotionally driven, you're not going to be able to know this. All you know is it feels good or feels like shit. And if you're in tamas, you don't know anything. You may be cycling, but you don't know anything. Because you don't see yourself as the cause of anything. And at the same time, you are the effect. You feel you're the effect of everything. So the tamas person is always outward in its dissatisfactions, projecting outward or inward in projecting it on itself. So this is the nature of sattva, is a diminishment to those two, tamas is a diminishment to those two, not knowing the cause, not being able to know. And when it looks inward, it's always looking at its habitual stories, its structures, patterns, beliefs, what it's been indoctrinated with. But in Rajas, it can begin to rebel and fight against that, but then of course there's suffering. Then of course there's, I can't change myself, things aren't getting better, so on and so forth. There comes the endless dissatisfaction of Rajas. Rajas's nature is to be dissatisfied. That's why it keeps moving. It's basically saying, this isn't it. It's not good enough. Whatever it is, it's not good enough. So Rajas is always restless, always moving. Sattva is the only one that can allow. So that's one thing you can recognize. Another quality of the three gunas is that the characteristic of sattva is to be, the characteristic of rajas is to do, and the characteristic of tamas is to have. These are the three actions, three modes of action of sattva, rajas, and tamas. Tamas is always trying to own, possess, control. It is very attached. It's accumulating for its own self. Rajas is not so concerned with that. It's much more about the activity. The doingness is the important thing. And the sattva doesn't need to do. It's perfectly fine with where it is. It's spacious beingness. So obviously, if we remember the previous cycle, the path that takes us upward is sattva. Takes us towards that superconsciousness. So as we develop within the three gunas, the path is towards reducing the tamas, reducing the rajas in the system, and enhancing the sattva, be it in the vital, be it in the physical, or be it in the mental. So we want to make all three of these as sattvic as possible. Then it's like a hot air balloon. It keeps rising. As it keeps rising, more and more the sattva starts taking on more and more of the characteristics of its origin, the sat. The sattva starts carrying on this powerful force that's the origin of sattva, rajas, and tamas. It becomes more and more cosmic, gradually, as it ascends into relationship to its origin. So it's possible that on the spiritual path, one can enhance their progress by taking advantage of the sattvic cycle. And how you take advantage of the sattvic cycle is you restrain the rajas. You restrain the tendency to step into action. And as you do that, you expand the sattva cycle. Now, of course, once you expand the sattva cycle, if this difference is significantly great, the tension to express rajas becomes very strong. So you would then, when the rajas came forward, would have to apply effort to restrain the rajas so that it's not as long as normal. And then when the tamas comes, you would have to restrain the tamas by asserting your ability to neutralize tamas, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then comes the next sattva cycle naturally. And by strengthening the sattva, then you do the same thing, reducing the tamas, strengthening the sattva, restraining the rajas, restraining the tamas. You can see that you're creating an upward trend. If on the other hand, when you wake up in the morning, you don't spend as much time in the rajas, you expand, in the sattva, you expand the rajas, you go into tamas, let's say you control the tamas, it does actually to some extent, so then you're not as low as you would have been before. When the next sattva cycle comes, you don't spend much time in the sattva, but you go into the rajas, and then the tamas comes, not as much. and then so on and so forth. The cycle tends to be a longer rajas and a shorter sattva and tamas, so you're basically staying the same. Here, you're ascending. And you can see the same action when you look at tamas. In the tamas cycle, if you wake up in the morning in sattva, it would be the same thing. You wouldn't give much importance to the sattva. You wouldn't give much importance to the rajas. You would give the greatest importance into whatever the indulgence was, and that would cause this further descent. Then when the ascending starts, you don't give much importance to that. You give not much importance to the rajas, and then you put your emphasis on the tamas. So you can begin to see that the tendency would be downward. If you can find your gunas, then you can begin to recognize how your actions have consequences relative to your consciousness. Now, the thing you should know about this is that at any one time, the Gita tells us, one guna is dominant. So when sattva is dominant, the rajas and tamas are less so. When the rajas is dominant, the sattva and tamas are less so, and so on. How we can move forward on the spiritual path is basically recognizing that of the three, of sattva, rajas, and tamas, is that sattva is the most powerful in terms of consciousness. Rajas is more powerful in this dimension, and tamas is the least powerful. So, if tamas is overtaking you, you can overcome tamas by applying the effort of rajas. And you can overcome rajas by applying the restraint of sattva. So when you don't let rajas take its action, when you restrain its impulse for action, it first there's suffering, because it wants to move, it wants to act. If you stay with the suffering, then eventually it becomes quiet. The ability to stay with the suffering is different for each person. If the rajas is very strong and very embedded, it may take years to gain a sufficient mastery over the rajas to sattva. But in tamas, you can see quite immediate results. For example, if the tendency is to be lazy, well then to get up and walk and exercise. The tendency is to overeat, then don't eat as much or eat the same, or eat foods that are not so weight-causing. If its tendency is to sleep, then you don't let it sleep. Of course, it too creates suffering. It's that suffering that's at the body level. For example, sleeping less. It's in the cellular level. If the body gets habituated to a lot of sleep, then when you start taking that away, it feels deprived. It actually physically feels ill. But you can train the body by forcing it into action so that it can learn to go get by on less and less sleep. Now, how much, what's the balance and what's appropriate, you always have to look. But we give much too much emphasis to our ideas about what body health is and the role it should have than it deserves relative on the journey of consciousness. That's why yogis would ignore the body, why they would go beyond food and sleep and sex and the rest of it. Because then in this way they were gaining more and more authority over the direction of their journey, strengthening the process of sattva in the path. Now, there is another way of overcoming tamas and another way of overcoming rajas. And that is, as in the Bhagavad Gita, through action, purposeful action, where the action is serving a purpose greater than yourself. If you have an action that's greater than yourself, then the habit of the body and the resistance of your tamas will be easily overcome by your rajas, because your rajas will align with the purpose. And then every time you make that sacrifice, every time you break out of the habit of your small life, of your old life, be it physical, vital, mental, then the more and more you gain the ability to do that more effectively. So through the sacrifice of selfless service, through the sacrifice of purposeful action, we can also go beyond the pull of these lower gunas. It'll be natural for us to fight the pull of tamas, or to restrain the negativity or the reactivity of rajas, to channel it positively, as long as sattva is the direction. So once you find a purpose in your life, once you've aligned yourself with your dharma, then this sattva starts strengthening naturally by taking the actions that your dharma indicates for you. What is that dharma? And that's the gift of the dharma. It is those actions that are most aligned with your innate nature. Your innate nature is this combination of the three gunas in the various components of the human system. You right now, at any one point in time, this can of course change, but you are a certain way right now in any one point of time, that this ability to go forward is the opening is our dharma. It is that thing that inspires us, that lifts us, that motivates us to go for something greater than what we currently know. This, no matter how small that piece of sattva, that can discriminate it. For example, some it may be, a person raised in the ghetto. All they knew was their macho and their position in the gang, and their relationships were just trophies. And then one of his relationships has a child, and suddenly it feels pulled to something. It finds something. Oh my God, there's this being, and I produce this being. Even though it's a little piece of sattva, it finds a dharma. It says, I need to change for that little being that has come from me. And then it starts stepping out of its selfish nature and starts being concerned about, how can I provide for it? How can I make this work? So each of us have a dharma proportional to the ratio of gunas and how they are within our system. Incredibly complex human beings are. What is it that moves them forward? Much varies greatly, and it's also true in the spiritual path. Even though sattva may be the organizing principle in the vital or in the mental or even in the physical, it still has many different permutations and aspects and demonstrations of what it is to evolve. But these are the underlying principles. My teacher taught us to track our gunas every single day. The thing I found is I could track my gunas best on the monthly cycle. I recognized that at the beginning of a new moon or a full moon, a day or two or 3 days before, I would hit my tamas. I was alert enough to know it was tamas after it was going on for a while, because I would recognize, for me, it was a lot of physical pain, discomfort, digestion problems. They were all indication of the tamas. And that I knew that what comes after tamas is always rajas. This is one thing you may not be in the sine wave, you may not be so clear, but the gunas cycle in this way. It starts sattva, rajas, tamas. So the sattva phase leads to the rajas devolves into tamas. It hits a low point called dejection. A point where it's a collapse, you're at the bottom of whatever that cycle is, it feels like crap, you're not in touch with yourself, your meditations haven't been good. And one thing you should notice about this nature of the gunas is that when you're in tamas, it's always been crap, it'll always be crap. When you're in rajas, it's always been interesting, it always will be interesting. When you're in sattva, it's always been divine, it always will be divine. So in your frequency, when you're down here, you can't know shit from crapola. You just are in shit. So how can you know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel? You won't believe there's a light in the tunnel, because when you're in that state, there is no tunnel, little less light. So the nature of this, in my experience, is where things are crappiest. Now my mental and my vital are pretty pure, so it's mostly in the physical. But I know now this is what it is, very consistently. And then that's usually when the samadhis come on. And then I can say, oh, it was just the asat coming forward. Because tamas is asat. Rajas is the force of the gods, the force of the creation. And sattva is in the perimeter of the superconsciousness of the sat. So it's the asat is the samadhi. And it's one kind of samadhi. And then there's another kind of samadhi that is the sat, the superconscious samadhi. They both are samadhis. One will convert, will leap a person from tamas directly to sattva. And the other will just lose itself in the absorption of sattva. So you find your cycle, if you can find your cycle in relationship to the full or the new moon. It could be, some people, when the full moon or the new moon, they're at the peak of sattva. Or they're way up there in the sattva. So you've got to find where you are, and you'll find that it will repeat very consistently for a period of time, at least until your sadhana changes it. And even then, there's an echo of it. So now for me, tamas is samadhi. The asat samadhi. And because I've had it for so many years, it doesn't have as much pull as it used to. Because basically this tamas in my body, the tamas in the matter of me, has been transformed. So too, depending upon how far one goes on the spiritual path, and in part that determines by your innate guna what you're capable of. I started the spiritual journey in the physical. It just so happens my physical was more sattvic. I was very rajasic in the vital, perhaps somewhat sattvic rajas in the mental. But it was the body that awoke. That's what Kundalini awakening is. There's sufficient sattva in the physical, and the body wakes. For others, the Kundalini wakes in the vital. There's sufficient sattva in the vital, even though the mental could be tamasic, even the body could be tamasic. But the more sattvic or sattvic rajas the system is, the more likely the Kundalini awakening will fulfill itself, will complete. Especially in the mental, or we would call the psychic as well, because it would know which way to turn. It would turn spontaneously to a teacher, turn spontaneously to come out of the particular situation it was in. For someone else, the sattva is emphasized in the mental, and this is the awakening experience. When the sattva is stronger, which is right now prevalent in the West, there's more sattva in the mental in the West, in this group of people, than any other time in history. So the awakening is much more natural in the awareness. So you wake up into the context in which what you were was the content. So you become aware of the content of you. And that even that journey can only complete if there's sufficient sattva in the the vital and in the physical. If someone awakens in the vital, there can be tremendous devotional feelings. Tremendous feelings for God and truth. But if the mental doesn't have enough discrimination, that it runs off chasing one teacher after another teacher and not going anywhere, seeking the experience and not any conclusion. It stays in the activity of seeking out the experience without owning it, without recognizing its source. So it's still in ignorance because of either the mental or the physical still has a hold. Tamas still has a hold. It's also true if the mental is rajasic and it opens up in the psychic, the vital opens up and there's a love of God. Then there's this frantic search for more of that. It wants more of it. and it wants to read and study and learn and do all the time. It becomes aggressive in the doingness of the rajas, which then distracts from it. It's looking to get something. It's looking to accomplish something. It's looking to succeed in something, converting the process that occurred in the devotional without actually allowing for the sattva to continue to expand in the mental and in the physical. So that's the one nature of the upper guna. If you awaken in the mental, then you want to avoid the vital and physical. If you awaken in the physical, you want to avoid the vital and the mental. If you awaken in the vital, you avoid the mental and the physical. Because the awakening is where it is, right? That's where you want to be. Okay. All right, well, that gives you a little more information about the nature of the three gunas. So, any questions? All right, Muffy.
I'm not really getting the distinction between physical and vital. I know you said that you were sattvic in the physical. I was thinking you were probably tamasic in vital and physical. And
to some extent.
So I'm not quite sure how the physical would be sattvic and the vital.
Well, physical becomes sattvic if, like, the rajas in it has pretty much, the tamas has been overtaken, the rajas has been overtaken. Because I was very purposeful in my life, and I was very much loving what I did, my architecture, my hobbies, my hiking, and so on and so forth. My physical was being dragged along in the process, and my mental, while my mental and vital were more rajasic, they were also sattvic, so they were positive rajas, they weren't negative rajas. So there was this, body was becoming an instrument for me to enjoy my rajas, the things that I was interested in. So it automatically became purified. So I slept less, and I only ate what supported my work, and so on and so forth. I didn't listen to my moods or impulses at the physical, even in the vital level. If the moods didn't feel like it, it didn't make any difference. I went and did it. I recognized that no matter what my mood was, that if I took the action, the mood would dissipate, and it would change. So that's when, even before I knew about the gunas, I knew that I could go beyond tamas by not listening to the mood. I didn't know anything about how you restrain rajas, though. I mean, as a human being. All I knew was the solution to life was rajas. Keep busy, keep doing things, keep finding things out. But I was curious. Mental was always curious.
So climbing mountains could be a sattvic expression of the physical?
It depends. If you're climbing the mountain one step at a time, enjoying, well, if it's inspiration, then that's rajas. If you're doing it sattvic, then I know someone, Eric, when he hikes, he's the slowest hiker you've ever been with because he enjoys every piece of the hike. He's completely connected to everything. So he's not really exercising himself. The danger with sattva, like in his case, is tamas accumulates in the physical because everything is good just like it is. So the tamas accumulates, and before you know it, his habits are running him. So there has to be a balance between all of these things. Each has its own role to play. So if you're climbing, if you have a purpose, then you're rajas probably. You're moving through action. One who's inclined to the path of action is basically rajasic. That's what Arjuna was. He was sattva rajas. So his inclination to action was positive, but it was mostly action. And therefore his system was rajas, diminishing the tamas. And in the process, because if it's purposeful, if rajas is purposeful, it completes itself. And when rajas completes itself, it becomes wisdom, it becomes sattva. It becomes peace. That's why when you work out, there's this peacefulness. It's not just the endorphins. It is the fact that you've transcended, you've exhausted the cycle of the rajas in a positive way, and you're being put into the state of consciousness that exists when rajas isn't there.
One more?
Okay.
I was surprised when you said that out of tamas is when you go into samadhi. I would have thought samadhi would have gone out of sattva. But then you also made a distinction between an asat samadhi and a
Sat samadhi.
and a sattvic samadhi.
Yes.
Could Could you expand on that?
Just like that. Because who experiences the samadhi? It's the vehicle in which the samadhi arises in. So it has to do with the nature of the vehicle. So in my system, it took 3.5 years to process out the remaining tamas in my system. And then I began to experience a relationship to the super sat, to super consciousness sat. And my meditations then changed from going deep into my body, into the physical bliss that occurs when I would go deep. And it became either a presence samadhi with the eyes open and just in the all-pervading reality, or in the transcendent samadhi that would occur in the ascending process. So each are forms of samadhi. This transcendent samadhi, where you become absorbed in the transcendent samadhi, you can be standing. That's in the creation. You can just stop and be absorbed, and time can fly by. My teacher was that way. He went to a temple one time and came before a statue of Rama, and for 8 hours he didn't move.
He stopped. Did his breath stop?
Yes, everything stopped. There's no way a human being can stand completely unconsciously, rigid, upright, without samadhi. Each system determines it, but they're also absorptions of consciousness in its original nature. That's what they are. Whatever form it takes, an outward form, a deepening within yourself, or a transcendent form. So there's a tamasic samadhi, a rajasic samadhi, and a sattvic samadhi. And they're all equally valid. Okay, good questions. Okay, that's enough for today. Love and blessings to you all.